So I am just going to quickly run down our list of panels here with introductions, and then we'll jump into the conversation. Let me start all the way to my furthest left with Forrest Sill. Forrest is a third-year computer science major at the University of Chicago and an editor-in-chief of the Chicago Maroon, which is the independent student newspaper at the school. Forrest is interested in the intersection of journalism and technology and how the industry can meet the demands of modern consumers. He is also currently working in software development and previously served as as the digital director for the University of Chicago Students for Hillary Clinton. Then we go to Saeed Jones. He's the executive editor for culture at Buzzfeed, a Pushcart Prize-winning poet. His debut poetry collection was called Prelude to Bruise. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His next book, a memoir, is forthcoming from Simon & Schuster. His work has appeared in NPR, The New York Times, Ebony Magazine, and Tin House Magazine. Then we have Jessica Contreras. Jessica is a 21-year-old immigration activist. She came to the US when she was 5 years old and has since lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. Jessica became involved in activism in 2011 when she saw the struggles that her family faced being undocumented and that they could not have some of the same opportunities and access to education that her peers did. Jessica wanted to be part of that change and wanted her voice to be heard and is working now to organize her community to be more active and stand up against anti-immigration laws. And then, right next to me, we have Liz Plank. Liz is currently senior producer and correspondent at Vox. Prior to Vox, she was a senior correspondent at Mike, a news site focused on giving a millennial perspective, and co-creator of Flip the Script, a weekly video series confronting social issues. In 2015, Liz was a correspondent for MSNBC's Shift Crystal Clear and was named one of Forbes' 30 Under 30 in media. All right, so that's it. And then we have me. I should say that we are all millennials, myself included. But one of the things I think that we consistently hear from folks is sort of confusion about who millennials are, what this generation is. I will say that there is not a lot of agreement on that. There's not even a lot of agreement on the exact definition of what a millennial is. The Census Bureau defines it as people who were born between 1982 and 2000. But the Pew Research Center will say that it's folks between 1980 and 2000. Give or take a few years, we're all still within that group and identify as millennials. But I will say, sort of from the get-go, I think one of the big takeaways about millennials is that we as a group are fairly diverse and don't really care for labels. I think the Pew Research Center actually did some research where they found that millennials as a whole really don't care for the label millennials. Not a big surprise. But I will say that there are some common sort of issues or concerns around this generation. And so I want to start with just a really quick round robin. Maybe, Forrest, if we could start with you, and just take a quick minute to identify for you, both maybe individually or maybe your friend circle, what issue or issues are most important this presidential election cycle, and we can just go down the list.
Yeah, so I think the issues that are millennials are most focused on are largely issues they see that their parents haven't dealt with appropriately, and obviously the biggest one is global warming, and that's clearly an issue that affects people 100 years from now, way more than it's affecting people today. And I think millennials are upset that it hasn't been really handled, and it's the evidence has been clear for a long time, and that's their issue.
Absolutely. I'm 30 years old, so I think when I think of my segment of the kind of millennial generation, we're certainly thinking about economics and debt, what is sustainable. Right now, I think a lot of millennials are getting used to making it do and creating new ways of paying bills and using apps, for example, to start new businesses. But what about when we need to raise families? What about when we're ready to own homes? Will that be possible? So personally, in addition to causes like dealing with police brutality and diversity across different industries, I think we're really looking at economic policies that will allow us to pursue the American dream in perhaps the way our parents and grandparents were able to.
Well, being that I am an immigrant and I'm an immigrant rights activist, I think it's no doubt that my biggest concern is immigration. Mainly because I only have a work permit. I have no legal status. I can only work. and I would like to be able to continue studying and get back to my community, which kind of makes it hard right now because I have to work and then I have to pay out of pocket when I would rather, be able to get a college degree and do the things that I want to do, like start a nonprofit. So.
Yeah, I wanted to start with a comment about the label millennial, which I think is very funny. I worked inside a newsroom at Mike where we called it the M word. Like we were told, and I agreed with that direction at a certain point, to not use the term millennials to speak to millennials because millennials wouldn't click on those headlines and be interested in those articles and wouldn't share an article with the M word in it because they begrudgingly didn't want to be identified that way. So I think that that's pretty interesting. I don't know if any other generation resented their label as much. But yeah, for me and I guess for a lot of young women, I think it's women's issues are very pressing when it comes to things like abortion and ideas around birth control and access to reproductive services. In a lot of ways, in our lifetime, it's gone back. We've had a really great decision come out of the Supreme Court in the last couple weeks, but in the last couple years, it's just been one bad decision after another, and we now have a presidential candidate talking about, punishing women for having abortions, and then taking it back and then saying we should punish. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around those issues, and that is scary for a lot of young women.
I think too, it's worth saying. I mean, you can even see, right, like the folly of like the idea of a millennial agenda. Look at the diversity of ideas and concerns. And I think one thing that is fair for this generation, and again, it spreads people who are 18 years old to 35 years old. That's a huge gap, right? But I think in general, you see people reaching out and trying to look into conversations and issues that may not directly impact their lives, but recognizing that we all are in this together. And I think that idea of collaboration, of listening more to groups that you may not be a part of, is something this generation seems to take pretty seriously.
Yeah, that's true. So millennials are now the largest generation in the country, according to census data. They rival baby boomers as a political force in this November's election. If millennials turned out to vote, they would actually turn out they sort of make up a third of the electorate. That's the same percentage that baby boomers are expected to be.
We're coming for
if. And that's the big thing I wanted to ask you all about. I mean, if we can start right there. I mean, I hear so much about sort of the potential of millennial voters, what millennials are interested in, sort of what our generation is interested in. But look, I mean, I talk to people who don't want to vote. Do you all have that experience? And I'm wondering, how do you sort of engage with the idea that there's a lot of potential, but maybe, your generation, our generation, will not necessarily turn out in ways that will be able to affect this election?
Well, I mean, young people are apathetic about politics. Young people are hungry for change. They're energized, and I don't think are apathetic about anything else. But sadly, don't see, and I'm speaking in very general terms, a lot of young people don't see the political system as a way to enact the change that they want to see in the world, and they see a Congress that can't even pass a Zika bill before they go on vacation for the whole summer, and the world is just left hanging. They see, a 14-hour filibuster and get excited and watch it on social media and then think that there's going to be change, and it's the same thing because this side wants to get elected and that side wants to get elected, and that's why politicians do what they do. And so that's why you see a really huge drop in interest in getting engaged in politics. There are not a lot of young people who are interested in becoming politicians. They are interested in going to Silicon Valley or becoming entrepreneurs. And so that's the route that they see in terms of, again, enacting social change. And so to me, the low voter turnout is a symptom of that. If young people believed in our political system, they'd be more likely to turn out to vote. I think that they don't think that their vote matters.
Go ahead.
I do agree with the end that definitely a lot of people around me that are my age, they kind of do have that feeling where, okay, does my vote really matter? Like if I voted last time and I didn't really see a change, But from my point of view of what I do in the community, I can say that I think that this year we're going to have a big Latino voter turnout for young adults. There's a lot of people just turning 18. There's a lot of people that are older than 18 that are Latinos. And what drives us, I say us because I do voter registration. I try to get people to go out to vote, is that we're doing this for our families. You know, maybe my friend can't vote, maybe my mom can't vote, but I can go out and vote for her. You know, I can lift up those voices, and that's one of the biggest things that in my community I see that is pushing us millennials to go out and to vote and to have a say in some form of way.
Yeah. I say, I'm Saeed, my name means happy and fortunate in Arabic, so I try to be optimistic when possible, and that is certainly a fight during this election season. I think there are 3 reasons actually why I think millennials are going to get out and vote. I think one, Donald Trump scares the hell out of a lot of people, and in particular, young voters of color, women, certainly people who care about immigration. You know, as a Black gay man, I mean, Orlando is very much on my mind, and seeing the way all of these conversations, it's not just rhetoric, it is real, you know? And so I think a lot of people are going to step up, and you certainly see Latino voters registering, you know, in pretty high amounts. I think Hillary Clinton as a potential president is going to be an important draw for certainly a lot of women, but also a lot of people who want to believe, however imperfect she is as a person and politician, that perhaps there is a bit of hope. Maybe there's another opportunity for us to get this American project right. So I think they're going to turn out. And then there's my generation. I grew up in Texas, so George W. Bush was my governor when I was coming through school, and then I saw, you know, him enter the White House, and then my generation got to finally vote, and we saw, you know, 2 terms of President Barack Obama. And so I think if you are certainly like in the latter part of the millennials, you've seen this amazing range of politics, and I think you see what happens when you feel that your leader isn't representing you, and I think we're going to turn up because we don't want to feel that way again.
And I will quickly add, kind of going off Liz's point, I mean, young people have social media, and no other group of young people had social media. And that's a way for us to be politically involved and engaged in a way that's not voting. And I think a lot of people would say that voting is the highest form of political engagement, but you know, posting on social media is political engagement as well. And I think to say that one's better than the other, that's a value judgment. But to say that young people aren't politically engaged because they don't vote, that's just not true.
That's a really interesting point for us. I spent some time recently in Cleveland interviewing young African-American activists who are protesting around criminal justice reform. They're sort of very actively involved, and one could make the argument more actively politically involved than simply going up and showing up on election day. But for some of them, they, as Liz was saying, didn't see a point in voting. They didn't feel like it was actually going to affect their lives. I want to, let's go ahead.
Well,
yeah.
and one, just to jump off that point, there is a correlation between, I mean, Facebook users are more politically engaged, and Facebook users are actually more willing or more likely to vote. And so there is also the correlation. I think we can't let people think that, you know, liking or posting a status on Facebook is all young people are into, and they think that that makes a difference. They're you know, influencing their friends, and also and we've seen movements like Black Lives Matter, I mean, use social media to change the platforms of candidates. I mean, there was a Black Lives Matter plank on the Bernie Sanders website after Black Lives Matter activists used the internet and also real-life protests to enact that change in policy.
And I'd add too, I mean, I tend to think of social media as enacting. I do think it's political engagement. It's the right, you know, it's assembly, it's petition, it's kind of collecting ideas so that there's a sense of data for how many people feel a certain way. But also, I think a lot of young people are going to be motivated by watching what's happening in Europe with Brexit and seeing how young voters who overwhelmingly voted right to remain and how they feel now at seeing that the voting generation that is going to have to live with the fallout of this decision for the shortest period of time, voted most overwhelmingly for the UK to leave. And so I think, young people, again, like social media has brought news into all of our lives in a way that's much more tangible, and it's all over the place. It's not just the newspaper at the breakfast table anymore. So I think people are paying attention and will get active.
And you can connect with young people in the UK in a way that probably wouldn't have been possible, even 5 or 10 years ago.
We can hear what they have to say in real time.
So on that note, I mean, Saeed, one of the things that was interesting to me about that Brexit vote, particularly in the way that it was interpreted by some of the younger voters, is the sort of the race or the xenophobia that seemed a part of that campaign. And one of the things that's parallel and very interesting to me about millennials is that it's the most diverse generation to date. When you look at stats, about more than 40% of millennials identify as people of color. Do you feel that there is a way in which that actually affects the politics of our generation?
I think it affects the politics of our generation in the sense that it's just who we are. For a while I worked at Buzzfeed as the LGBT editor, and I would be so surprised when I would talk to teenagers, and I'm talking 12, 13-year-olds who had such more of a sophisticated understanding of race or gender fluidity than I did. And I thought about, like, in high school, just struggling to come out of the closet. I wasn't able to do it until I was a freshman. And now there's, like, trans middle school students, with their parents showing up to meetings. So it's amazing. It's just kind of who we are, and I think that's true for diversity and recognizing, even if you are a US citizen, the immigration conversation is absolutely central to our American politics. Is that going to be reflected in how political figures respond to us? I don't know, because as I was saying at breakfast, I think politicians and corporations still think of millennials first as a consumer demographic, rather than as a block of citizens that has aspirations and needs. And if you focus on, like, how can I sell to them, how can I market to them, as opposed to what do they need, what are they not able to do right now, that's really going to impact whether our values are reflected by our elected officials.
Forrest, I wanted to ask you something that you talked about Facebook earlier. One of the things that I find so interesting about the way that campaigns continue to spend money is on ad dollars for television ads. And yet our generation, I mean, I can say for myself, I don't actually own any cable.
Does anyone
I don't pay for cable.
Do any of you own cable?
Many of us, yeah. Okay, there we go. None of us are actually cable purchasers. So where do you consume your news? When you look for news, is it Facebook? I mean, where do you go?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times it is Facebook, and before everyone shakes their head, I mean, Facebook does a really good job of giving, in my opinion, what we want, right? It's a mix of, you can get stories from credible news sources, you can get stuff from the New York Times side by side, from other stuff you're interested, from your friends and family, and that's a really cool way to consume stuff, right? That's a pleasant way to consume news. And I'll also go straight to, the New York Times app or the New York Times website, but one particular way that I think millennials do an interesting job, and I think this is a really cool thing, is Facebook makes it really easy, and Twitter does also, to share content from a publisher and then also add a few sentences, more than a few sentences, of your thoughts to go along with the content, which I think, in one of the panels yesterday, someone had a negative thing to say about this, but I think it's a really good thing, right? So you can share an article, like we can call it the facts, from something like the New York Times, and then you can put 2 paragraphs of your opinion on top. And I think that's a really cool way for young people to engage politically while also not biasing the information, because the facts stay pure, and you can go to that article and still see what the actual truth is. So that's kind of my favorite way, is to see what my friends post, what they say about it, and then have comments and the little 6 reactions on Facebook, and see that's kind of how we engage.
No, definitely, and I just have to add to that. I'm also I think we're a year apart, so I definitely get a lot of my stuff from Facebook as well, especially because the network that I have on Facebook is a lot of the people that do the same work that I do. So when something comes up, when there's always news, something, I guess you can say it's fresh. I know I can go on Facebook, and majority of my friends have already shared it from New York Times. I also get a lot of the news from Univision, mainly because of Jorge Ramos. But so it's definitely that thing, you know, where you can find these articles and you can find what your friends are thinking and comment, and that way you're interacting with each other. You might not be in the same place, but you already know what your friend thinks, and so what do you think about it? And then you start this whole conversation, and other people join. And like you said, you know, we're actually participating versus just, okay, well, oh yeah, the article in the newspaper looks interesting, but you don't really talk to anybody else about it.
Right. Yeah, you go.
Well, just a small interjection. I think, so I watch cable news for my job, and I basically have two screens. One of them is Twitter and TweetDeck, and the other is CNN. And I love TV, even though I don't have a TV, I have an Apple TV. And I think it's one way of getting news, but I actually trust my Facebook and my Twitter feed and my social feeds more than I trust CNN, because that one is curated by what people like me care about. So if I turn on CNN, you know, I get what some people, you know, who are of an older generation believe is news and are covering that, and I will get a totally different series of stories and again comments and even like takes on what CNN is doing, which is also really interesting. And a lot of what we did at Mike and what we do at Vox, you know, like, I don't know, I gave this example yesterday at a panel, but the German Wings pilot, that was a news story, right? And CNN was talking about it as a mental health issue, that this guy just, you know, went down with does everyone know what story I'm talking about? It was a German Wings pilot who basically took down the entire plane and killed, you know, everyone on that plane. And if that man had not been white, it would have been a terrorism story. It would have been told totally differently, and I would have not gotten that analysis from CNN. And actually, I think what happened on social media ended up changing the way that CNN covered it. So there's you can't talk about it, I think, in silos, and more it's gonna become totally, melded together.
Something I was gonna add to it, if you're my age, I was 12 or 13 years old when Matthew Shepard was killed. And if so you think about, you know, puberty and coming out and all of those kinds of questions at the same time that this horrifying story, you know, about this anti-gay bashing is all over the news. At that time, I could only depend as a teenager on our local news station, right, or Dateline, you know, the kind of standard, you know, here's the USA Today's take, here's the New York Times. If they covered it, if they didn't, how they covered it, I was totally vulnerable to those institutions, right? Now, if we think about like Orlando, right, a similar horrifying case that lights up identity and fears, and seeing that I didn't just have to depend on legacy institutions that I still read every day, like the New York Times or the New Yorker, but we could also look at Twitter, follow a hashtag, and see what people in the Orlando area, people who've been engaged in this community for years and years and will continue to do so, how they feel. We can read essays and video projects from all over the world in the country, and you're not just limited to your water cooler conversation or your dinner table conversation. You can really engage people across the world. And so I think social media is certainly not perfect. It's a new technology. We have no idea in some ways what this is going to be doing to us 20 or 30 years from now. But in the short time, I think there's an opportunity for us to engage with more freedom. We make our own newspapers now, as opposed to having it handed to us.
So let's talk a bit about the November election then, in terms of how candidates are addressing the concerns of our generation. I think sometimes when people think of millennials, they think of overeducated, underemployed, you know, coffee baristas. I mean, there's sort of very negative associations of who I think this generation is, particularly when it comes to education levels. And one of the things that I find really interesting is when you dig into the data, a majority of millennials still do not have a traditional four-year college degree. And yet we continue to hear the candidates talk to us through the lens of student debt or college affordability, which no doubt are very important, you know, issues. But I'm wondering for you all, I mean, how does that affect, or the way that candidates are talking about the issues that you care about, affect how you feel about not only voting, but about the particular candidates that you have to vote for this November?
I think a huge thing, I will just say, one huge thing for millennials, and you know, I have no idea if this happens to other generations too, but I think you definitely see it this election cycle is authenticity. And they really care about being treated as like a full-fledged adult, which we are, but, and also not being pandered to. And I don't know if old people don't like to be pandered to, but we definitely don't. And I think you saw this with the the Not My Abuela hashtag after Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Can you fill folks in on that? Yeah, real quick.
Well, I just know there was some backlash to something that Hillary Clinton did that was perceived as pandering to the Hispanic community.
Yeah, Jessica, do you want to fill folks in real quick, just so that they know the backstory? Yeah.
So I think from what I remember, she made this little video of kind of like how she relates to the Hispanic community, and kind of saying that all these, I'm similar to your grandmother. And so then all these memes started coming up, and people were like, you don't represent my grandmother. You you can't just pretend that you do these things that Latinos do and try to say that you're like my grandmother.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Hillary's been tough for a lot of millennials to support, is because she's seen as not an authentic candidate. And whether you want to go into the whole sexism issues surrounding that or not, but it's clear that someone like Bernie Sanders does come off as more authentic and more genuine, and that's really important to millennials throughout their lives, not just in their political choices.
I completely agree with that, especially because a lot of the people around me are like, well, Hillary Clinton seems to only speak about this when she thinks that she's going to get somebody to go and vote for her, versus like, this is in her platform, and this has been in there the whole time, instead of, okay, along the way, she's been changing her mind about things. And you notice that, whether you started like with these certain ideas in the beginning, and then you've been changing, like, can we really trust you?
Right.
I mean, that's what comes with having decades of experience and working in politics, is that, like, yeah, you've changed your mind on big issues, just like I've changed my mind, on over the course of my life over, many issues. And I think the authenticity, I mean, this is probably gonna be unpopular, but I actually do get annoyed with the way that some millennials choose candidates as like, and I think Obama is a perfect example of someone who is totally authentic or appears to be very authentic and energizes and inspires. But I don't think that that's how we should choose who leads our country. Like, I don't necessarily, I think I would want to have a beer with Hillary Clinton, like, for sure, but I also think that's not what should determine who should be the leader of the free world.
I think the politics of authenticity are so interesting because interpersonally, when people say, well, I'm just keeping it real, I'm just being honest, it's usually after they've said something incredibly rude, right? That's I'm just keeping it real. Now, and then if you take that to the next level of communication, people say, well, I'm just not about that political correctness. And I'm like, okay, but have you noticed that your being politically incorrect almost always skews towards you saying something incredibly offensive as opposed to something challenging, right? And so, and again, I feel the same way. I look to effectiveness. That's what I'm more interested in. I'm not trying to have brunch with Hillary Clinton, and I'm not trying to have anything with Donald Trump. I'm interested in a leader who can get things done, who can face what appears to me to be one of the most intractable Congresses this country has ever seen. And so, knowing that authenticity is just something that's just a veneer, I don't trust it. And I think I hope all voters can move past that as a concern, because I think it's used as a weapon. I think it's used against women. I think it's used against people of color in manipulative ways. And I think straight white men, it's like, well, what does it mean to be an authentic straight white man? Rich and powerful. Oh, you got it. So it's like, it's not a very fair fight or platform, really.
Right.
Can I ask you guys, I mean, you were just talking about Donald Trump, and we've had, Forrest, I know that you were involved previously with your college group for Hillary Clinton. This generation overwhelmingly leans left. You can look at poll numbers recently that the Harvard Institute of Politics does. They do a semi-annual poll on millennials. Overwhelmingly, it looks like Hillary Clinton has the support of millennials over Donald Trump. To the degree that you guys, I know not everyone maybe feels comfortable sharing, but could you tell us a little bit about how you ID politically and why, or was there a moment in time in which you sort of cognizantly made that decision to be a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. I'm definitely a Democrat. It never really. I mean, it was never. being a Republican was never like a reasonable choice. I don't know.
Well, first, can you explain that? Why? Like, why was it never a reasonable choice for you?
Oh, just everything. So, I mean, it's really consistent, and that's what's so impressive, right? Whether it's gay marriage or immigration or gun control or you know, how we treat people who aren't white or how we treat immigrants. It's every single issue. It's hard to believe why you would be on the other side.
You asked. I mean, I think, you know, I certainly skew liberal for some obvious reasons. And, you know, obvious reasons. You know, I'm black if you can't tell. I'm gay if you hadn't picked up on that earlier. You know, and so certain degrees, there are certain policy decisions that I feel are a matter of human rights. Whether that is talking about criminal justice, whether that is talking about LGBT rights from same-sex marriage to now, you know, transgender people being able to use a restroom without being harassed. So, you know, I obviously skew that way, but also I don't trust anyone. I think I've been paying attention to politics long enough to learn that this binary is in fact pretty much an illusion. If a conservative candidate appeared who sounded effective, you know, who found a way to engage nuance. And honestly, the GOP right now is in such an interesting position where if you're going to draw a contrast to Donald Trump, you end up kind of sounding not that different from President Barack Obama when he was first running in 2008, you know? I'll say also that I'm frustrated personally that it feels like there's only one viable presidential candidate. I think both parties should do a better job of giving us all effective options. So it doesn't look like, well, we gotta go that way, or do we really want this alternative? No American should have to feel like it's an either or voting dynamic, regardless of how you side politically.
Jessica, do you want to chime in?
Well, I would definitely say that I consider myself a Democrat. I think, again, for obvious reasons, like the other party obviously wants to kick my family out, myself out, and a lot of people who have created jobs, who have, you know, helped better the economy in so many ways. And, you know, why am I going to go on that side if they're trying to, like, get me out of the country? And to be honest, this election has been kind of hard for me because, okay, Bernie Sanders, I've heard him speak a couple times on immigration personally, and he says a lot of things I think us young Latinos want to hear. And, you know, that's one thing that caught my attention. He's saying a lot of nice things to your ear, but are these things really possible? Like, we have to be realistic about it. Can he really do what he's saying, you know? I'm sure that he wants to, but is it really possible? And then you have Hillary Clinton, who at some point wanted to deport all children coming in from Central America that are seeking violence, a refugee here. And now she's like all pro-immigration, and she wants to do something as well. So it's like, at some point I was like, well, you know, if I was able to vote, I'd probably end up voting for Jill Stein.
For Jill Stein. Got it. Okay.
I am Canadian, so I think that means I'm like a communist.
Plot twist. Plot twist. Mr. Prime Minister.
Yes, I will not.
Can we vote for Justin Trudeau?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, Justin Trudeau is
perfect.
Perfect, handsome, amazing. He's the anti-Trump. I mean, he's, and I didn't invent that term. I think it's something that we in Canadian media has been used a lot and talked a lot about. I don't know. I think it'll be really fascinating if Donald Trump is elected president to see him have to interact with Justin Trudeau. I mean, America and Canada are, you know, have such an important relationship. Their economies are interdependent. Canada depends more on the U.S. than U.S. depends on Canada. But the first thing that Justin Trudeau did when he was elected was, you know, let in 25,000 Syrian refugees into Canada. I was on my way here watching it. Yesterday was was Canada Day, so our national holiday. And the video that was on my newsfeed was this young refugee who was asked by a reporter, like, you know, and she's in the street and there's celebrations and she has a flag and she's wearing red, and the reporter just sort of asked, like, how are you feeling today? And she just starts talking about how she just moved here and how she loves Canada, and she just starts weeping. And she's 8 or 9 years old. And I have chills even talking about it. And a really beautiful representation of what Canada, I think, the direction that we're headed in. And Justin Trudeau it has been, I've been just so proud to be Canadian and feeling very happy that my family's in Canada right now, because I think there's a lot of feelings of instability. What happens if Donald Trump is president, I think is incredibly scary for a lot of people.
And I think that the idea, also, I'm sorry, I was daydreaming about Trump interacting with Angela Merkel and like, but also like that, like what you were, the relationship between pride, like you were saying, like feeling so proud of your prime minister and how that could impact your civic engagement. And again, my generation, you know, seeing President Obama come into office and, you know, the pride. And I think even, you know, with the Brexit, however people voted, they were proud. You know what I mean? It meant something to them. They saw a connection between their personal identity and their national identity. And I think a challenge with millennials and politics at the executive branch level is that it feels like a real disconnect. A lot of people, I think, you know, and I think, and this is why Trump has become relevant in the way that he has for people who support him. They feel such a disconnect between who they are and the America they thought they signed up for. You know, and so whether you skew liberal or more conservative, I think that pride is going to really impact whether you show up at all and how you vote. We all want to feel proud the way you do.
Right. So I want to have time for questions, but I just have one last question for you all. So maybe we can do, again, sort of a quick round robin, a minute or two response. And that is, you all are saying how you have some concerns about Donald Trump's candidacy and that you lean, I know some of you said that you lean towards the Democratic Party. I think Forrest, you said for very obvious reasons around policies. Looking ahead, considering this generation is the largest generation, we may not vote right now, but historically people tend to vote and participate more as they get older. If the Republican Party does not make inroads with this generation, that will be disastrous politically. And you hear, analysts say this all the time. I'm wondering, from your side, is there, any advice that you would give the Republican Party to make inroads with you and with your generation?
Well.
Saeed, you said, Saeed, how about you? Because you said that if there was a conservative candidate, you would be willing to cross the aisle. So what would you like to see, or how would you like to be spoken to?
Right, well, I guess, in order for a viable candidate to emerge, that's the end of a very long pipeline. Anyone who's interested in actually making real substantive change knows it's slow, knows it's boring, it takes place when the cameras aren't looking, and it's not an election cycle. I think that's what needs to happen, and when you see the GOP or the DNC throw together, throw several Black and Latino people on stage or form some random little reactionary committee after an embarrassment, usually. That's not impressive. What I'm impressed is, I'm impressed when people recognize at the core level, we need to rethink what it means to be American, what it means to represent the American people. What are they saying? What are we hearing? And you can demonstrate that, one-on-one, you can demonstrate that with platform changes, but I'm never impressed with a change that takes place at the 11th hour or in response to an embarrassment. And I think for a lot of politicians, that's the only way they demonstrate change.
I think for me, and I think most millennials, the Conservative Party's main weakness is on social issues. They were totally failed on gay issues, totally failing on immigration, totally failing on race issues. I know there are a lot of people I'm friends with who identify as Republicans, and they're Republicans because of Republican fiscal policy. And I think they have some merit to their fiscal policy and absolutely no intellectual foundation to any of their social policy. And if they want to have any shot at millennials, they need to change that. Because I think they can keep the fiscal policy and still do pretty well with us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I think one of the great things that came out of recent weeks of debate around gun control have been some Republican senators. Senator Ayotte is a great example. She voted for the Democratic proposals that were being brought forward by Senator Murphy, who led the 14-hour filibuster, even though the NRA staunchly opposes those bills. And she took a huge risk, because if the NRA doesn't like you, and especially if you're a Republican, that's a huge liability in terms of re-election. And so it'll be actually interesting to see what happens to her in November. But I really respected her basically taking perhaps an unpopular position, but a position that she believed was right.
That's authenticity.
Exactly.
That's authenticity.
Exactly. It's not being cool on Facebook or Snapchat. It's voting for what you believe in.
Jessica, do you have any thoughts?
I think I agree with everything that we've been saying here, especially because I think that a lot of the things that matter to us, the Republican Party just kind of takes it as, okay, well, they're not going to go out and vote anyway, so why are we going to address the issues that they're worried about? And I think that if they take the time to see what issues we really care about and speak to it and see, have like a viable plan, a plan that, that can be put into action and that it's going to work. And I think that's just in general for any candidate as well. Like, if you want to attract us, then you have to have a plan. You have to know what issues we care about. Because if you're not speaking to us, if you're not addressing the issues that we want to see something done in, then I don't think that I would be too willing to go out and vote.
Well, thank you guys so much. We have about 10 minutes remaining, so if you raise your hand, we have folks with microphones. Why don't we stop right there in the back? Yep, gentlemen with it.
Hey, thanks so much. Very interesting. I could feel the interest in the room earlier when you guys all made the comment that none of you have a pay TV cable. And, I think there's a lot of us that are very curious. We know the typical millennial, hates on Abercrombie and Fitch and loves Apple, etc. But could you talk maybe for just a bit about either companies or institutions that you think are in gaining favor and doing well with millennials? Thank you.
Okay. And why don't we just have one or two folks respond to a question so that we can get through a few? Does anyone want to chime in particular? I
hate to do the stereotypical thing, but I think social media companies, I think millennials really recognize the value of social media, that it really has a power to have a positive impact on the world, and especially a positive impact on the least fortunate people in the world, right? These are services you don't have to pay for, you can use with a relatively cheap device, and I think oftentimes older generations focus on the negatives, younger people focus on the positives, so those companies pretty much across the board.
Anybody want to chime in?
Yeah, I think like companies that have a social enterprise or corporate responsibility wing to what they're doing, and I don't always agree. I mean, I think Dove is a good example of a company that's trying to invest their own profits into creating a better world. They've had a lot of campaigns that are pro-women and changing beauty standards, but they also feed into
Dove soap?
Sorry?
Dove soap.
Dove soap,
okay.
yeah, sorry. And they also feed into the problem, but then they're trying to fix it, which is okay. And I think Coca-Cola is another example of, they're trying to fight bullying. If it's always successful and effective, and I don't know, but at least when there's like an attempt to care about the world that we live in, I think that millennials are behind that.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think millennials are drawn to industries and corporations that are creating jobs, right? And I think, so that's why social media or new media companies, right? I mean, are creating jobs that did not exist when some of us were in college or even graduate school. And so we're looking for opportunities, and I think in some ways that directs a shift away from perhaps traditional stalwarts, because it seems like all of those jobs have been outsourced.
All right. Yep, women, sorry, right here on the left. Yeah.
It is my impression that in contrast to us boomers, who had actually very little direct interaction with our parents, that your generation, as are my children, are a lot closer to us and share a lot more with us, and we share articles with each other through the different channels than my generation ever did with our parents. Do you think that affects you in any way? It's because typically when we talk about the parental involvement, it's in a negative form these days. But in fact, I think there's a lot more intergenerational closeness, interaction of sources of information, of readings, of music. Do you experience that? the way that I think we experience it differently from how we were when we were your age.
First of all, I love you so much. Your talk yesterday and then the day, anyway, I'm like, I didn't even know you were in the room. So you're, Esther Perel, everyone should follow her and her work. I'm so impressed. But I agree too. I mean, I was just texting my mom who's in Portugal and on vacation, and we're in totally different parts of the world, and I'm probably have more communication with her than any other of my friends because she has a smartphone now, which is great, and she has Facebook, and even when I help her with things like Facebook and understanding how her phone works and what the cloud is, it really builds this relationship with her where I can feel like I'm taking care of her too, in the way that she's always helped me learn things about the world. I can do that too. So I absolutely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think, technology's made it easier because we have more ways to communicate, right? All of us are not big verbal communicators, perhaps, with our parents, right? But or vice versa. But certainly you can engage in different ways. I'd say too, I mean, for this generation, 2008. For example, it's like right when I graduated from college, the recession hit and it impacted so many families, right? So that was a moment that would have been a lot of independence, and we might have seen us go this way, when in fact families actually had to come together because either financial structures had to change, people had to live at home a little longer. So I think that's been a big key.
Right.
We only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to get a few more questions, so why don't we take a couple and we'll ask so gentleman right here in front. So we'll take a couple and then we'll answer them collectively.
Thank you. When discussing your political preferences, there wasn't a single mention of foreign policy. Why is that?
All right, thank you. And then gentleman right here in the blue polo.
Hey, thanks, Adam from San Francisco, overly educated former barista.
It's a safe space. You're fine. You're fine. We're all friends here.
Media. I want to talk about other kinds of regular media. We've got NPR, we've got Mike now at Vox, we've got Buzzfeed. I think that sometimes when people hear about social media, they worry that the discourse of our generation is dumbed down, and I actually think that there's something to that to a certain extent. I don't think it's 100% true though, and so I would love for you to talk about places where the dialogue and discourse in our generation can still be elevated or where we need to elevate it.
Got it. Okay, let's take one more real quick. And there's a gentleman right here, I think, in the front. Sorry, you had yours.
My name's Gunnar Sachs. I'd like to know a little bit, you've been speaking a lot about your political drives and your political views, but there's a whole sector that's not addressed within the political realm. So what do you feel are the driving forces of your generation that don't address or that aren't addressed within the political realm, but just are drivers for you?
Right. Anybody have? Let's take the foreign policy question first.
I can start with that one. I think this might just be me personally. I have less of a problem with Republicans on the foreign policy side of things. I think there's less distance between Republicans and Democrats on foreign policy, and I think within parties, there's more distance between Bernie Sanders and Hillary. I think there's a lot of distance, and maybe Hillary's even closer with some Republicans than she is to people in her own party. So I would actually be comfortable with plenty of Republicans in terms of foreign policy.
I think, at least I feel personally that domestic policy has been so ineffective in the last few years, and we're finally in a moment, where there's some stabilization in our economy. I would love to see an investment in some long-term decisions that impact us here, because I argue you can't really guide foreign policy effectively if your house is on fire. And to me, I feel as a voter, our house is on fire, and so that's kind of why I think I tend to skew to think of domestic policy.
Yeah, I agree.
I was going to say, on that note, I was mentioning earlier the Harvard Institute of Politics poll. They poll every 6 months on millennials. And about a year ago, they asked about ground troops to fight ISIS. And they saw a very high percentage of younger millennials who did support that idea. I'm the older batch of millennials, so we remember September 11th and the wars. And I think there's quite a division generationally, intra-generationally, they were saying, which was interesting. The other question, I'm sorry, was about news sources, right? In terms of where we perhaps go beyond social media.
I mean, also, you know, I've been at Buzzfeed for 4 years now in different roles, and now I manage a team of 25 people in culture, so LGBT, books, podcasts, culture writing, you know. So people are asking me all the time, like, how do I get a job at Buzzfeed? And I tell them, like, learn to read and write. Critical thinking, you know, the same thing. The technology is going to change. Media transforms so quickly that it's difficult to point to certainties that will be relevant by the time someone gets out of school or by the time they develop a new company. I think both for people looking for jobs or people looking to bring nuance to this kind of social media age, it's the same core values, learning to write with nuance, learning how to listen, learning how to really communicate and critically think, because social media puts the onus on all of us now, right? We have to be editors as individuals in a way that wasn't expected. And so I think it's not so much looking at specific companies or institutions, but looking at what it means to be an active reader and writer.
And yeah, I think active is for me the term. I mean, I you know, work at Vox. I love Vox. Everyone should go on Vox.com. I'm literally proud of every single article that comes out of Vox, which is, I think, very rare. But I also buy the New York Times every Sunday, like the paper. Like I go to the bodega and I give them a $5 bill. I don't use my credit card because they don't take credit cards, and I buy the paper and I read it because I love doing that. And I actually put my phone on airplane mode, and sometimes I'll have things I want to tweet while I'm reading. I'm like, no, do it later. I think that having that diversity is really important, and being active and seeking out those sources too.
And I will say, I work at NPR, so it's very sort of old school traditional media, you could say. And one of the ways that I think we've been trying to change our coverage this election cycle is we launched an NPR Politics podcast. And I am amazed at the age of our questions. We got questions from 13-year-olds or 18-year-olds. Our average listener, just judging based on the questions, is barely beyond a college graduate. To me, I also wonder if it's sometimes just the avenues that we are consuming our news from. So last quick question recently we were asked was about sort of beyond politics. If there are avenues or ways, I'm sorry, you were saying that we could get our issues addressed. What drives us as beyond politics?
You mean in terms of just values? Okay. I had the pleasure of going to the Women Who Lead panel last night and New Narratives. It was absolutely brilliant. I think perhaps the best conversation I've gotten to see. And I was thinking about collaboration. You know, I was raised Buddhist, and in my household, my mother, it was about dialogue, it was about listening, and it was about learning how to collaborate with people who have strengths that can complement your strengths. That is a core value of mine that lights up every part of my life that seems in some ways diametrically opposed to the way US politics work. So if there's a value that I would love to see more, it's that, you know, being willing to reach across the aisle with perhaps an unexpected ally. That is not something to be ashamed of. That should not be a risk. That should be something we praise.
Yeah, and I think we put a huge emphasis on relationships. I mean, I was at the talk last night about sex and all that fun stuff. But I think we're so connected. We're such a connected generation, and it's easy to see it as we're all on our phones, we're all alone together. But I think we're so connected to each other, and those relationships really, really matter. Whether it's with our family members and that, you know, rise in being able to feel connected to them, but also the people around us and people we will never meet in our entire life. I mean, we've been like Twitter friends for a while, like years.
The first time we've met.
We've actually, and we both live in New York. We both work in similar industries. We've just never met, but I felt always very close to you, and I love you, and I think you are such an important human in the world, and yet we'd never met. Right. But that doesn't mean that the relationship is not valuable.
Yeah, when I showed up to the Aspen Ideas Festival, it was my first time here. I was very intimidated, and by chance, walking up to the NBC tent, the first person I saw was a woman that I befriended on Twitter I haven't seen her in like 5 years, but we immediately connected, and she took my hand and she guided me across the whole campus, and that was my introduction to Aspen Ideas Festival. This woman that I haven't spoken to directly, certainly in at least a year, and we haven't seen each other in 4 or 5 years, and that's the power of connection. So, you know, don't totally underestimate social media.
Yeah.
And one thing, if I had to pick one value that across the board I think young people share, it's the desire to change the world and the ability to think that we can. And call that hubris, but I think at least the desire to change the world, regardless if you're going into nonprofits or like investment banking, I think young people believe that the job that they're doing can change the world and that they have a duty to do it.
We are out of time.